the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. And 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." All right, so he tells him at this point to go into the ark, to bring his household with him. This is the statement, "For I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." What is the premise upon which that judgment by God is made? Okay. I think that's a good answer. It's especially a good answer when you couple what we've read with Hebrews chapter 11 and the reference to Noah acting by faith. Anything specifically that works out to mean, considering the immediate context. You go back to the verse just preceding this, and it lays the premise for which that statement is made. Noah did all this. He did all that God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." Keeping in mind that the ark itself represents God's deliverance, God's salvation. The thing that separates, what's the fancy religious word for separated? We have been set apart. What's sanctified? So the thing that sanctified, set apart Noah and his family and these creatures from the judgment of God was the ark. And the water, which was about to come, separated them from death. What was the basis on which they received God's sanctification? To go into the ark, to go into that space of deliverance. He did everything that God commanded.
Yeah, I heard she said it, and then to put those two together, the obedience of faith.
Exactly. And by the way, that's where the book of James comes into the discussion. And a few other places comes into the discussion, but primarily James chapter 2, that explains in very direct terms that the only living faith that's able to act and work is faith that is demonstrated by works. That in the absence of doing what God has said, our faith is what? Dead. Just as dead as a body is when the spirit has left it. And so, working, active faith. We use terms like obedient faith to try to be clear and to try to help people who don't understand what faith is. But in truth, if you use the word faith and you use it appropriately, it inherently is obedient. And this is one of the places where we learn that. Noah was delivered, according to Hebrews chapter 11, by faith. He built the ark by faith. He did everything that he did by faith. And so when it says Noah did this, he did all that God commanded him, and God said, "Go into the ark, for I have seen that you are righteous." The next thing we need to put together in this discussion is that righteousness is directly connected to active faith. Can anyone be righteous who is not working by faith? And the answer is no. That is what makes one righteous, which is very humbling, or at least it should be, because it tells me that when I'm working under my own desires, that I'm not being righteous. One of the ways that that's expressed, and I keep drawing from James, but James is a great book for this purpose, and it hadn't been that long ago since we studied it. One of the things that we learn from James is that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. My motivations, my desires, my feelings about things, that don't produce righteousness. What produces righteousness is when I do everything that God's instructed me to do. And that's what this is saying. Noah did all that God commanded him, and the Lord said, I have seen that you are righteous. In this generation, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals. All right, what are the clean animals? We hadn't actually, up to this point, had a whole big, long discussion about what made clean animals and what didn't make it. That actually comes later. So I'm not sure if these are the exact same animals that are called clean in the law of Moses. But there's clearly a distinction to be made between what he's calling clean animals and animals, therefore, that would not be in that class. Yes, ma'am. I don't know. Right. Yeah, and there are lots of animals that were excluded under the law of Moses as unclean, some really strange ones. South Louisiana folk wouldn't do well living under the Jewish law. Most of everything that they eat is not permissible. But that notwithstanding, whether or not this is exactly the same class of, I don't know, but clearly there's some kind of instruction that had come from God at this point that distinguished what they are. And of those animals, and by the way, they weren't ones that were used for food. I've actually heard people say that, well, the ones that he would have been eating, he took more of. No, because at that time they didn't eat animals. I don't know exactly what was used to sacrifice on the backside of this, but when we get to that, we're going to find out that there are some animal sacrifices that are offered after the flood. And so possibly it's connected to that. But it involved certain animals and birds. And the distinguishing is with those animals, it wasn't just a pair, it was what? 7 pair. By the way, I'm going to just introduce this for consideration because I don't know what all translations everybody's reading. There are some translations that are not very clear at all in this, and some of the language is almost identical between the clean and the unclean, whether it's 2 and 2 and then 7 pairs of the unclean, whether or not it would be 2 pairs of the ESV makes it very clear, at least these translators believe it was 1 pair of the clean animals and 7 pairs of the unclean animals. So we're talking about 14, 7 males and 7 females of the unclean. By the way, that's the only way you can get it done because it's an odd number. And so you couldn't have a male and his female unless you had 14 of them. So it makes it a lot clearer in this that take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals and 7 pairs of the birds, also male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth. And so these animals needed to reproduce. By the way, these may very well be the animals that he had in mind to become their food on the backside of this. I don't know. But they needed more for population purposes. And that does present itself in the text itself, as that's the reason why. To keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth. Those particular animals, for whatever reason, needed more to accomplish keeping them alive on the other side of this. I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And so we are down to a week. He says, go on the ark, because in 7 days the rain starts, and when it starts, it is not going to stop for 40 days. It's going to rain 24/7 for 40 days. God did all that Noah had commanded him. We learned in verse 5. And that is a consistent characteristic of Noah throughout this story and the discussion of this story in the New Testament. It is key to understanding everything that's happening, is that what we have is a clear scenario where God is speaking and saying, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I need you to behave, and Noah is listening. We're going to end up led to death and destruction. The only is if we do everything that God asked, and we can't add stuff. Noah did all that the Lord commanded him, came upon the earth. Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. And so it's pretty clear about the purpose of that. He went onto the ark to escape the waters of the flood, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, of everything that creeps on the ground. 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. Now, the language in verse 10 is a little bit different than the language at the beginning where he says, in 7 days the rains will come, and it'll rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Notice that the language here says, the waters of the flood came. And I think that that difference is somewhat important. We're going to talk about that as we read this story, because it was more than just rain that generated this flood. Listen, 40 days of rain, not good. 40 days of rain, whether it would cover the highest mountain on the earth, we don't have any basis on which to conclude that. It take a lot of rain to do that. We're going to find out that that's not where the flood waters came from. And, by the way, the creation story, understanding the creation story is actually important in understanding what's said here. And references are made to it in the book of Job as well. So, flood waters were much greater than just the rain. That was just part of it. And I'm going to go on record as saying all the stories that I heard when I was a kid that it had never rained before. I don't know about that either. It doesn't say. It said that back in the garden that there was a mist that arose to water the ground at that time. I don't know that they had ever seen 40 days of rain, but what they hadn't seen, flood like this. But everybody makes a lot about building a boat when it's never even rained. Well, I don't know. I think that's making too much out of that statement. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Now, this is where the source of the flood came from. Let's go back, way back to Genesis chapter 1. And let's just start with verse 1. We'll go through probably 7 or 8. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Notice that, over the face of the waters. He created the earth, and the Spirit of the Lord is hovering over the face of the waters. God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and separated the light from darkness, and God called the light day, and darkness he called night, and there was evening and morning the first day, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. So he's going to separate some of the water from the other water. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. He created an atmosphere around the earth, a canopy of water that covers our air. Then it says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place in verse 9. God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together. He called seas, and God saw that it was good. So what we see is, at one time there was water everywhere with the earth. God separates the waters above the heavens and the waters below the heavens, and we still have an earth that's completely covered with water. And then he creates dry, he pulls the waters apart and makes dry land appear. And Job talks about this, talks about the fact that he has placed gates on the water and said, this far shall your proud waves go and no further. He's put limits on where the seas can go. We have courses of water that run through the earth now. That's where we get our drinking water from, most of it, except for the poor people that have to use surface water. And then we have this canopy of water that creates our atmosphere. And let's go back to our text and read again what it says. In the 600th year of Noah's life, this is verse 11 of chapter 7. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Those waters on the earth that he separated and collected and put in place and said, this is where you got to stay. He let those go, and the wind is putting the earth back into the state that it was, and nothing was alive. Isn't that what he said he was going to do? I'm going to blot out every living creature. Water that go to the beach, when you're standing there and you're watching the waves crash ashore, and you see the power of the water, this is your boundary. And the reason why it stays there, when God says, I'm not going to hold these waters back anymore, the waters rush back to where they want to be. This is what happens. We're going to read about what happens. So every day that we have a piece of dry land and we have air to understand that it's because God's power is at work to make this a habitable place for us. Yes, sir. Yeah, there's a lot of water.
And so it's fascinating that even thousands of years ago, this differentiated between the springs of the great deep and the heavens. Like you say, I mean, it's nowhere near enough water just from rain.
Right. And by the way, that's where a lot of skepticism comes from. They read this story and they say, well, that's impossible. It couldn't be a flood that covered the entire earth and covered even the highest mountains. Had to just be a regional flood. That's not accounting for all the water that is out there. And that's not accounting for what we're told in the Genesis account before God made the dry land. There is more than enough water in creation to make that state. The fact that we're not living in that state is because God is restricting and controlling where those waters go. And that's the power of God. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I mean,
And you see, it's almost as if, thousands of years later,
Right. Interestingly enough, we also have stories of gods. Among them are gods that control the oceans and control the waters. It's essentially what Poseidon is. And when we portray Poseidon in our minds and we portray this God who he's able to call the waters and have them go where he wants them to go and do what he wants them to do and rush in, and that's the power of God. We are attributing the power of God to something that we create in our own minds when we do that. And that's what men do in idolatry. That's what men do when we worship ourselves, is we assume to ourselves the power of God. We do that to some extent, I think, today. I think this whole idea that we're going to do something to alter the weather and the climate of this world, if we make some changes and we behave differently, that the climate's going to... We don't have that. Who created the atmosphere and the climate and the water cycle, and who put the oceans where he put them, and who made the rains fall, and where does that power reside? I don't have the power to do that. God has the power to do that. And that's what this is showing. When God decided that he was no longer going to keep the earth habitable, he let the water go. He opened the door and just let it run where it wanted to run. And it got bad. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, verse 13, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark, and they and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And so it's land-dwelling animals that rely upon air to live and function. That's what entered the ark with him. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And in this whole thing, what you see is that Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives and all the animals, that they are all active in doing those things that God commanded. They are passive in doing those things that they have no power to do. They had nothing to do with when it happened. They had nothing to do with how it happened. They had nothing to do even with shutting the door of the ark. God had them do the things that were theirs to do, and God did the things that were his to do. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. We have things to do, and when we do those things and God sees that we're righteous, then he does the things that he promised. And that's the picture of Acts chapter 2. And all those souls hearing the gospel and repenting and being baptized, and the Lord added to their number those who were being... God separated them for salvation, just as he's doing here with Noah and these animals. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased, bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface, or on the face of the waters. The waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Again, we're just returning the earth to the state that it was before God made it habitable for man and animal. The way that it was when God made the heavens and the earth. And it was covered in water, and there was no dry land. The waters prevailed 15 cubits deep. And if the 18 inches to a cubit is about right, then we're talking about how many feet? a little under 30 feet, that it was above the highest mountain? All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Look at that. Verse 21 sums up unimaginable carnage and destruction in very short order. There's a few people in this room who have lived through very limited floods and seen the havoc that comes from that. We have 10 people, 20 people die from a hurricane. That's a huge event. The population of the earth died. And listen again to how it says it. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. There it is. Okay, everything died. That's all the Bible says about it. This isn't designed to be graphic. This isn't designed to portray the carnage. This is designed to capture the fact that what God said in His covenant is exactly what God brought about. How do I know God brought it about? Because He opened the windows of the heavens and the fountains of the deep. Because He brought the rain. How do I know that God's the one that saved Noah and his family and those animals that were on the ark? Because He gave the instructions to build the ark. He gave the dimensions of the ark and what it was to be built out of, and He closed the door. Man's job was as a servant, doing the things that God said. By the way, that hasn't changed. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils were the breath of life died. We're talking about millions of human life. By the way, this is the other thing that we don't often talk about. Some of these people were really old, like Noah. Some of these people were young. Some of these people were children. All life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. My mother, when they lost their house to the flood, I think the waters were prevailing for maybe 4 days, but I think it was probably closer to 3. And going back in behind that, everything stunk. Everything was destroyed. The grass and the plants were starting to die. 150 days, water covered the earth at a depth that we can't even start to grasp. What did that do to the earth? Now think about that. That's the judgment of God being pictured. That's the other side of Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. If you don't become a participant in God's grace, then you get to fall into the hands of the living God in a very terrible way. And this is the way that these covenants function. God sets down the parameters. God gives the work. God sets the timeline. God does His part. Whether or not we embrace that covenant and do all that God tells us to do is the determining factor upon which side of that we come in on. Because that's the nature of the covenant itself. Every covenant that God's ever made worked that way. So, that's the situation. Anybody have any comments or questions? There's a few folks that came into the live stream a little bit late. In a few minutes, Facebook should convert this to a video, and you should be able to watch the whole class. And then we'll be back in about a half hour from now with the sermon, if you have the opportunity to be with us.